Psalm 18. To the choir master, a psalm of David, the servant of the Lord, who addressed the words of this song to the Lord on the day when the Lord rescued him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. He said, I love you, O Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies. The cords of death encompassed me. The torrents of destruction assailed me. The cords of Sheol entangled me. The snares of death confronted me. In my distress, I called upon the Lord. To my God, I cried for help. From his temple he heard my voice, and my cry to him reached his ears. Then the earth reeled and rocked. The foundations also of the mountains trembled and quaked, because he was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils, and devouring fire from his mouth. Glowing coals flamed forth from him. He bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew. He came swiftly on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, thick clouds dark with water. Out of the brightness before him, hailstones and coals of fire broke through his clouds. The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the Most High uttered his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. And he sent out his arrows and scattered them. He flashed forth lightnings and routed them. Then the channels of the sea were seen, and the foundations of the world were laid bare at your rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of your nostrils. He sent from on high. He took me. He drew me out of many waters. He rescued me from my strong enemy and from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. They confronted me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my support. He brought me out into a broad place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. The Lord dealt with me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands, he rewarded me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord, and have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his rules were before me, and his statutes I did not put away from me. I was blameless before him, and I kept myself from my guilt. So the Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands in his sight. With the merciful you show yourself merciful. With the blameless man you show yourself blameless. With the purified you show yourself pure, and with the crooked you make yourself seem tortuous. For you save a humble people, but the haughty eyes you bring down. For it is you who light my lamp. The Lord my God lightens my darkness. For by you I can run against a troop, and by my God I can leap over a wall. This God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord proves true. He is a shield for all those who take refuge in him. For who is God but the Lord? And who is a rock except our God? The God who equipped me with strength and made my way blameless. He made my feet like the feet of a deer and set me secure on the heights. He trains my hands for war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. You have given me the shield of your salvation, and your right hand supported me, and your gentleness made me great. You gave a wide place for my steps under me, and my feet did not slip. I pursued my enemies and overtook them, and did not turn back till they were consumed. I thrust them through so that they were not able to rise. They fell under my feet. For you equipped me with strength for the battle. You made those who rise against me sink under me. You made my enemies turn their backs to me, and those who hated me I destroyed. They cried for help, but there was none to save. They cried to the Lord, but he did not answer them. I beat them fine as dust before the wind. I cast them out like the mire of the streets. You delivered me from strife with the people. You made me the head of the nations. People whom I had not known served me. As soon as they heard of me, they obeyed me. Foreigners came cringing to me. Foreigners lost heart and came trembling out of their fortresses. The Lord lives, and blessed be my rock, and exalted be the God of my salvation, the God who gives me vengeance and subdued peoples under me, who delivered me from my enemies. Yes, you exalted me above those who rose against me. You rescued me from the man of violence. For this I will praise you, O Lord, among the nations, and sing to your name. Great salvation he brings to his king, and shows steadfast love to his anointed, to David and his offspring forever. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. One of the most common storylines in the Bible is the story of facing impossible odds and being rescued at the very last minute from what seems like an unwinnable position. That's the story time and again in the Exodus, the story in the book of Joshua, the story in David's life, as we'll see. The story through the whole of the Bible is of feeling like you're about to face certain defeat, holding on to the promises of God, and then, like this, he turns things around and rescues, gives you the victory. Actually, that's not just the story of the Bible, is it? That's the story of every adventure story, of every thriller action movie. The hero ends up in impossible trouble and is sprung from the trap at the last minute by some twist in the tale. I take it the reason why those action movies, those adventure stories have that idea in them is that deeply built into our human psyche, our history as a people, is this idea that God himself steps down and rescues his people at the last moment. That is our great longing. That is our great hope. And the Bible teaches, this psalm celebrates, that it is a true hope. I said it's the third longest psalm. It's also repeated almost verbatim elsewhere in the Bible. So in 2 Samuel chapter 22, we get basically these exact words with a few variations in the story of David there. What I want to pick out in the midst of many, many words is just one word which comes up again and again. Enemies. David is facing his enemies. He's under threat from his enemies, and finally he defeats his enemies. So I want us to meditate this evening with David, with Jesus, through this psalm, on our enemies in relation to God. And I think there are basically two ideas, two kind of directions that this psalm goes in. The first is that God is our strength in trouble. He's our strength in trouble. When it says in verse 1, I love you, O Lord, my strength, the first sense that he means that in is, you are my defense. You're the one who helps me. You are my strength when I am facing impossible odds. I take it that's what's picked up in that amazing verse 2, where it just repeats again and again these defensive military ideas. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield, the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. All of those ideas are military defensive ideas. A horn is something you blow when you're in trouble to summon your help. Stronghold, fortress. A rock is somewhere you build a fortress. A refuge, a place where you are protected and safe. A shield is a defensive weapon. Verse 3 then summarizes this idea of God being a strength in trouble. I call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised, and I am saved from my enemies. Now, just to come back to what I said about this being a psalm which is quoted almost verbatim, or maybe it's the other way around, in 2 Samuel chapter 22, that's at the very end of David's campaigning life. So 2 Samuel chapter 21, the chapter just before, describes his kind of cleaning up of his enemies. First of all, in 2 Samuel 21, the story about Saul and David's enmity with him, which is mentioned in the superscription here, from the hand of Saul, is cleaned up in a surprising way, actually. David finally defeats the Philistines to such an extent that he recaptures the bones of Saul and Jonathan, Saul's son, and reclaims them and buries them in honor. Which I think is a sort of tender, when you consider the sort of brutality that we'll come to later on in the psalm, a tender reminder of how the Lord's anointed treats his enemies. Throughout Saul's life, David treated him with remarkable forbearance and respect. His love for Jonathan is famous, is proverbial. And his love extended even beyond their death. His respect even for his enemy, Saul, extended beyond their death to bury them. Nevertheless, 2 Samuel chapter 21 does describe the end of that, the kind of closure on that chapter of the Saul enmity between Saul and David. Also, in 2 Samuel 21, we see the end of the Philistine story. Obviously, the Philistines are still there. They come back in the rest of the history of Israel. But the story's wrapped up because the most famous of the Philistines is, of course, Goliath. 1 Samuel chapter 17. Goliath of Gath, the giant. Well, in 2 Samuel 21, David cleans up the Philistine story by wiping out the other 4 giants of Gath. Perhaps you didn't realize there was like some sequels. They span out the story for a few more times. It actually wasn't David who did it. He sent along his brother and some champions and stuff to kill the other 4 giants of Gath. Incidentally, you know that David brings 5 smooth stones from the brook. Well, some people speculate that that's a kind of, not just as a sort of taunt to Goliath, saying, I'm not just going to get you, I'm going to get all 5 of the giants of Gath. I'm going to clean up my enemies. But David looks back on the times of impossible, right up against it, odds that he didn't feel he could overcome, that he had experienced both with Goliath and the Philistines and with Saul. This is how it felt, he says, verse 4, the cords of death encompassed me, the torrents of destruction assailed me, the cords of Sheol entangled me, the snares of death confronted me. Perhaps we're to imagine David literally on the run, hiding in caves in the hills, from Saul. Saul with his military might, with his superior skill and technology. David with his ragtag band of former criminals and exiles. Having said that, no matter what trouble David is in, surely the way that it's described here is kind of overstated. Cords of death, Sheol itself, the underworld. When he talks about how God rescues him, he says, the earth reeled and rocked, the foundations of the mountains trembled and quaked because he was angry. He's talking about an earthquake. When he talks about the devouring fire from his mouth, he's talking about a storm, the blackening of the clouds, the loud cracks of thunder, and the brightness of lightning. The Most High uttered his voice, hailstones and coals of fire. He sent out his arrows and scattered them. He flashed forth lightnings and routed them. Now, even if there were some times that when David was up in the hills, there were actual earthquakes and storms and stuff, which are not recorded elsewhere in the scripture, it's still a kind of over-dramatic description of his trouble and how God came to rescue him. Now, perhaps we're just like, well, that's fine, it's poetry. You can use the kind of big picture of the weather to be able to describe your troubles. If you did A-level English or even GCSE, you know that's called pathetic fallacy. But I think it's more than just that. David is pointing forward to yet greater rescues to come. The rescue of Jesus Christ himself actually did include some of these things. Remember how, as he came to the end of his life, the earth shook. The sky was darkened. The rocks were split open, and the dead came out from their graves. Now, that's not just poetry. That's not just some stuff that's been added in to make it seem more exciting. No, that's actually stuff that happened to recognize the earth-shattering significance of Christ's rescue out of trouble. Remember that Christ also, unlike David, was actually blameless. Whereas in some of the other Psalms we've seen so far, we don't know in what time in David's life it refers to. So when he speaks of himself as blameless, we're like, well, maybe he actually, before he did all the stuff with Bathsheba, he actually was a kind of decent guy. Here there can be no doubt. This is describing David at the end of his time of conquest, long after the incident with Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite, where he had utterly disgraced himself in all the worst kinds of sin. And yet he still says, "The Lord dealt with me according to my righteousness, the cleanness of my hands." Verse 20. "All his rules were before me, and his statutes I did not put away from me. I was blameless before him." Let's be clear that for David, as for us, these are obviously garments 10 sizes too big for us. We can't sing these psalms, these words, in our own right. As we were saying last week, we must and can only sing them in Jesus Christ, who truly was blameless, who kept all God's statutes, who was guiltless in every way. And so, he was rescued. Rescued, I guess, from not sin only, but its consequence, death. That's the kind of picture that David wants to pick up, this idea of the grave, of Sheol, of facing certain death. I'm struck reading through the Psalms that they're most of the time not focused on our rescue from sin and guilt. If anything, it emphasizes the opposite. It just assumes that our guilt is taken away. Now, there are exceptions to that. We'll come to them in due course. Psalm 32, Psalm 51, Psalm 103. There are lots of others as well. But generally, the Psalms are not focused on our rescue from the guilt of sin. They're focused on our rescue from our enemies and from death itself. Now, that doesn't mean that the Psalms are kind of in tension with the rest of the Bible, in tension with Jesus or Paul or what's said in the New Testament. No, they all fit together. Rather, the Psalms remind us, they give us words to say when we're actually facing, in our own experience, what feels like impossible odds, what feels like enemies we can't overcome. We're to cry out like David, like Jesus, trusting in the Lord according to our righteousness. And Christ, of course, saw his enemies defeated. His enemies who pursued him to the grave, the devil, the religious leaders, the nation, were utterly defeated, even in their own lifetime. It was only less than 40 years after Christ's crucifixion and resurrection that the entire city of Jerusalem was destroyed just as he'd promised. Well, that was his vindication. And yet again, when he returns, all these things will be true. All his enemies will be defeated, and we, his people, will be rescued from them all. Now come back to verse 1, because that's in some ways the key to the whole psalm. How do we respond to knowing that we have a God who is our strength in trouble? Well, we say, "I love you, O Lord, my strength." That's our response. You're the one who rescues me out of trouble. You and you only. Verse 32. For who is God besides the Lord? Who is the rock except our God? What other help do we have in impossible situations? What other help do we need? The Lord is our strength in trouble. Second, the second theme that traces through the psalm, and it's mostly in the second half of the psalm, the Lord is our strength for victory. Perhaps we're more familiar, even if we tend to think about salvation in terms of something that's happened in the past, the forgiveness of sins. We're also kind of okay with the idea that God also crushed his enemies and defeated them at the cross and in the resurrection. What we see in the rest of the psalm is something that we're less familiar with, and we must reclaim if we are to walk in God's ways with confidence and strength for all of our life. Because God is not just our strength for rescue, not just our strength in trouble. He's also our strength for victory. He's our strength to defeat our enemies, to win. Now we see this in a kind of sequence, really, from verse 30 onwards. This God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord proves true. He is a shield for all those who take refuge in him. That shield, although it begins as a defensive thing, is now going to be flipped into the offense. Having been rescued from his enemies, the battle turns. And now David, Christ, we are pursuing our enemies, having been equipped by God. Verse 33, he made my feet like the feet of a deer and set me secure on the heights. He trains my hands for war. so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. You have given me the shield of your salvation, and your right hand supported me, and your gentleness made me great. Our salvation doesn't stop with us being forgiven and our enemies being in principle and truly defeated. It now continues with God giving us the strength to go on the offense against our enemies. And that's what David does, what the psalmist does in verse 37. I pursued my enemies and overtook them, and did not turn back till they were consumed. I thrust them through, so that they were not able to rise. They fell under my feet. Verse 41, they cried for help, but there was none to save. They cried to the Lord, but he did not answer them. That last line is quite shocking, quite striking, isn't it? That David cried to the Lord and was answered and heard. For these his enemies, who were not righteous and who were too late to it, they cried out to the Lord, but he did not answer them. And his victory is total. Verse 42 is really quite brutal. I beat them fine as dust before the wind. I cast them out like the mire of the streets. You delivered me from strife with the people. You made me the head of the nations. That's the end of his victory. The end of it is that his enemies just surrender. All the rest of the enemies, all the rest of the nations come and bow down to him and surrender, because his victory, his strength is irresistible and evident to all. I know I keep going back to Psalm 2 like almost every week, but that is because all of the Psalms do connect to Psalms 1 and 2 and 3, but especially 1 and 2. Okay, especially 2 most of all. They really do. And we've got this idea yet again that God is the one who gives vengeance and rule to his king. These are the ones who rebelled against him, who conspired together against the Lord and against his anointed. But God has made him the head of the nations. And they will either come to him willingly to make peace with him, or unwillingly, cringing to find out their fate. Who are our enemies? I often find it's hard. You read the Psalms and you hear about David killing people and stuff, and you think, well, I'm not going to be doing that. I hope I'm not in a situation where even in self-defense I have to do any of this stuff. I know some people will do that as their job, and that's good too, so I'm not knocking that at all. But for most of us, our enemies are not people we fight again physically. Who are our enemies? Well, the Bible, piecing it together, describes our enemies as the world, the flesh, and the devil. The world, those around us and their influence upon us. The flesh, our own frail and sinful hearts, still warring against us. And the devil, well, we know who he is, but he continues to be active. He and his wicked angels really are trying to stumble you and me today, looking for someone to devour. Psalm 18 reminds us that not only have we been rescued from the power of the world and the flesh and the devil, the Lord is also our strength for victory over those forces as well. I take it in this life, it's not a total victory. I don't believe that there's a kind of second blessing part where once you've cracked this, there's no more sin for you. No, we know and experience that the Christian life, the Christian battle, is one in which we make slow progress, one in which there's 2 steps forward and 1 back a lot of the time. But the Lord is our strength for victory, increasing victory and progress against our enemies in this life too. The physical warfare of the Old Testament is an image, is a picture, is a preparation for the spiritual warfare that we now engage in against sin. If Joshua was told to wipe out the Canaanites, we are told to wipe out sin, to put to death everything of the old person that remains. Romans chapter 8, verse 13. If you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. When it says, that striking image in verse 42, I beat them fine as dust before the wind, I cast them out like the mire of the streets. That is to be our longing in the battle with sin. To utterly destroy our pride. To utterly conquer anger, or whatever it might be. All sins to be put to death without exception. Perhaps you feel impossibly outgunned, outmaneuvered by your sin, by the world and the flesh and the devil. If David felt impossibly outgunned and trapped by his enemies, well, so do we. We feel our weakness to temptations, our feebleness in even bothering to resist. We feel the subtlety of the tempter. We look back and see how he has outwitted us yet again. We look around at the godless governments and employers and powers in the world and think, who are we to resist this? Who are we to live a holy life among the Gentiles? Well, in some sense, it's okay to feel that sense of we're on our last legs here. We're impossibly outgunned. What's not okay is at least my attitude towards that, which is not like David's. Because unlike David, I think, well, God has helped me so far. He's cancelled my debts and made me righteous in Christ and stuff. And now it's up to me. I've got to fight in my own strength, which is not very good, against these impossibly powerful enemies. David didn't think that. David knew that it was God who trained his hands for war. It was God who gave him the strength to bend a bow of bronze. It was God who put him in the right place to fight. It was by God's strength that he thrust his enemies through. Ironically, although we feel the great pressure of our enemies, we also underestimate them. We fail to understand just how powerful indwelling sin is in us. We fail to remember day by day that we are constantly under the attack of the devil. We fail to recognize that the world, as friendly as it looks on the surface, hates Jesus and all that belongs to him. We underestimate our enemies. Certainly we underestimate the standard to which we've been called. Remember how Jesus, reflecting on the Ten Commandments, said, "You've heard it say, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, but I tell you, it's even more than that. Walking in God's ways is all of the time, in every way, right down to your desires, and nothing else will do." But worst of all, we underestimate God's power. I say worst of all, it's really best of all, because if we repent of that, if we leave behind our failure to understand that God has given us strength for victory, it's only once we begin to do that that we can fight in his strength. Now, this is not by magic. This is not just a click most of the time where we click our fingers and suddenly we've defeated our battles with sin. No, it's not magic. No, but God has plainly given us the means and the power to make progress and in the end to conquer our enemies, the world and the flesh and the devil. Let's remember, though, that the psalm is not first and foremost about us. Before us, it is about one whose victory has already been demonstrated. Jesus really did overthrow his accusers. In his resurrection, in his destruction of Jerusalem, one day he really will rout all his enemies, and all that is wicked, all that is twisted, all that is unpunished in the world will be brought to light. Not because he himself is a man of violence, as is described in verse 48. You delivered me from the man of violence. But because he is a man of justice, of authority, of standing to put things right, and so a man of retribution. God gives to his king great victories. He shows unfailing love to his anointed, to David and his offspring forever. And we, if you like, are his offspring. Not because we're genetically descended from David, but because we are included in the true and greater David, in Jesus Christ. He shows steadfast love to his anointed, to David, and to his offspring, and to us forever. Let me conclude by, hopefully not in too banal a way, by just describing defeat out of the jaws of victory in a way that came to my mind this week. In 2006, the FA Cup final was between Liverpool and West Ham. And it looked like it was all over for Liverpool. Some of you guys are probably literally weren't even born then, which horrifies me to think of. But the captain, Liverpool's captain, Steven Gerrard, had a terrible cramp. He could literally barely walk, and he was kind of coming off the pitch and stretching and all this stuff, and you saw him hobbling along. And the 90 minutes were up, and the commentators were announcing that there were a couple of minutes of added time or something. And the ball comes to Steven Gerrard out in the midfield, impossibly far out from goal, and he just swings his damaged right leg and scored an all-time great goal to set up the later win on penalties. The reason I mention that is I hope that it'll stick in your mind, because I used to watch the highlights of that with added sort of hyped up, pumped up music, just when I felt a bit low and I wanted something to cheer me up, because it was just such a great moment of victory out of the jaws of defeat. I watched them again this week for the first time in years. It's amazing. You can look back to 2006 and YouTube was still in 480 pixels, and man, you can barely watch that stuff now. But, I did, and it still works. Psalm 18 is that. I hope a better and purer thing and a more profound thing than that. It is a hyped up, backing music, reflection, song, highlight reel of God's victories, of Christ's victories, of our victories in him. And more than just looking back, he's looking forward and saying, now you have the strength to continue that fight and to win for yourself. You're facing impossible odds. You're facing inevitable defeat. That's the best place for God's people to be, because they cry out to him and he answers. And so we say, I love you, O Lord, my strength.